how you can take advantage of the 2023 landscape to dominate your draft. That's what we're going to talk about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work at RotoViz, including his very recently released 2023 draft plan. All of your priority targets, Shawn, how to play the different positions. It's a fantastic piece. You write through, we talked about this last year, the guys that you would take when they fall and the guys that you more or less wouldn't take ever, as well as the targets, the priority targets, the clear targets, different layers of targets, different little names. I love it. I'm excited to look through it. You just published it today as we are recording, so I have not had a chance to look through it yet. But that is a fantastic piece. Definitely need to be subscribed at RotoViz to get access to that. And Shawn, today we're going to tie together a bunch of concepts, not so much about player targets, although the ways that the player targets interact with the draft landscape is a big part of it here in 2023. But we're going to talk about draft strategy, and we're going to tie together a bunch of concepts that have created a really interesting drafting blueprint for 2023 drafts. It's something that I've written about over at Stealing Signals a couple of weeks back. It's something both of us have written about in the last few weeks. Unsurprisingly, we are in lockstep on it. But it's a really interesting dynamic, and it starts, and for people who have listened to all the Stealing Bananas episodes, they're going to be able to pick up on it pretty quickly because it ties together a whole bunch of things we've talked about, but it starts, I think, in the running back dead zone, which is this really key range this year where we have quarterbacks going higher than ever, and so they become an option in that range. We have, I think, more tight end options at the top. Tight ends have always been, sort of worth chasing in the single-digit rounds, but I think we have even more this year that make them worth targeting. And then the big thing is in the dead zone this year, we have a subset of actual running back targets, which, we've talked through over the years, the running backs that you can draft in rounds 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, and how those tend to be profiles of players that have not yet broken out yet, and they're younger and they're being held down for dubious reasons related to projected touches as opposed to what they might actually become when they break out, or if they break out, if and when they break out. We have a group of them this year as the landscape has shifted. Running back ADPs have fallen a bit. That has made drafting different. It's made your approach different, and it's created ways to think through, okay, how do I leverage this new drafting climate with raised quarterback ADPs, falling running back ADPs, receivers getting more expensive than ever. What's the best way to structurally attack this? And certainly, Shawn, there's the discussion that we've had for a long time about getting a lot of receiver depth early. It's still an important goal. But something that we've both come to this year is, listen, at some points you have to make sacrifices in drafts, and there are opportunities this year that even make it worth sacrificing that goal to a certain extent because of the unique upside that is out there for us in 2023.
And as we kind of think through that, hopefully this episode, we're planning to have as much fun with it as we can. You mentioned tying it together, and I was thinking, ideally, this one would sort of be the dude's rug, right? We're going to be thinking about how these concepts interlock. And one of the things that first jumps out to me when I am thinking about that piece with the 39 priority targets, when I'm thinking about the draft tactics that I'm recommending this season, when I think about the 3 FFPC main events that I've had a chance to draft, including one, Ben, that you and I did this weekend that's going to release later in the week. It's been so much fun, and yet all of the drafts have a lot of risk in one way or another, but they also create this sort of tapestry at the end where the teams that I'm drafting have a lot more potential embedded points, and they have a lot more ways to win than most of the opponents. Now, you and I had an elite drafter in our draft who was taking a lot of our targets. I've experienced that in most of the drafts where, I mean, there are some other people in those rooms who are making really good decisions. But most of the teams, when you look at them, their path to winning is more or less that their guys stay healthy, their starting lineup stays healthy, and they more or less draw perfectly, and that's how you do it. And I say that, not that that won't work, because there is the possibility that the team that wins the league and then the team that goes on and wins the $1 million. Certainly, if you're thinking about this from a home league perspective, the team that goes and wins and gets to brag to friends and coworkers and college buddies and whatnot throughout the entire year, there's a possibility that it will be the team that stays the healthiest, right? And you just have that starting lineup that works. And if you stay healthy, I mean, you're almost certainly going to score points almost by default. It's hard to get it too wrong when you're talking about those first 7 rounds. Again, if everything works in your favor. But one of the things that you and I like to do, and one of the things that I've always really emphasized, is where could we have elements of certainly individual player profiles and then the draft in general where you have scenarios that are actually not that unlikely, but are being priced as though they're nearly impossible. And then you try and stack all of those things together. So then the next step for me is that I'm seeing these scenarios as not that unlikely. Most of the draft community is seeing them as very unlikely, which means that partly that's exploitable, but partly I'm likely to be very wrong a lot of the time. And so my draft plans have to include a lot of contingencies and a lot of sort of emergency exits to where I can be wrong and be wrong a lot and still win. So I think that's kind of a fun way to think about it. Certainly we talk about humility-based drafting. But as we kind of look at how the pieces interlock here, it brings me back to that, because I think that we're going to end up being wrong a lot about specific players and specific scenarios that play out. So then the question is this plan that we are about to work through, is it one that allows us to be wrong and yet still win? Is the upside more or less asymmetrical with the way that we're constructing things, both on the individual player level and then the build level, that we're going to be able to be wrong on a few things and still come out way ahead? And so the first thing that I kind of think about there is that, I mean, you and I have done some vaguely contrarian things, at least from what we talk about on the show, in previous drafts and in previous main events. So we have some teams in the past where we've gone fairly running back heavy early. And exactly the way that all of the evidence and all of our research has always pointed out, those teams have not done well. So then the question is, how and why and to what extent? It's really in a lot of ways, again, to what extent is 2023 different, and so different that drafting those running backs, drafting some of these guys who, I don't know if they even necessarily have warts, but some of them are, hold-in types of guys. Some of them are coming off of injuries where they seem to be more or less healthy. But the thing that you mentioned there, and the thing that everything kind of starts with, is that rounds 3 through 6 this year are giving you running backs with first-round profiles. And that doesn't just have a huge impact on how you play those rounds, but it has a huge impact on how you play rounds 1 and 2.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you make a good point with the injuries. That's a question I've gotten multiple times, and my response has been, as it relates to Breece Hall, as it relates to Javonte Williams and these guys coming back from major knee injuries, that we should just be fading them because they're a year off the ACL. And I know there's a lot of evidence that shows that guys coming off ACLs tend to perform at a lower level, etc. And then the really great example of Adrian Peterson, people tend to want to write off and say, well, that's just one example. It's Adrian Peterson. Well, it is only one example, but it's an example of a guy where a guy went for 2,000 yards, first of all. So let's he ran for 2,000 yards the very next year. So let's at least take it as possible that somebody could play at an incredibly high level coming off of an ACL, right? That's one. And then, I mean, one of my responses has been that, I'm pretty willing to operate in sort of the gray area with this stuff where, yes, there has been some bad recent history on these things, and J.K. Dobbins is fresh in a lot of people's minds last year. But Dobbins had some complications. He ends up having to have another surgery. Like, that doesn't mean that every knee that heals is going to have complications. That's not, if we think about this logically, how things work. It's more of a medical question than a football question, right? Breece Hall is already being clocked. Early in camp was being clocked at running 23 miles an hour, apparently, and then it was 21, but if you see the videos from camp, he's running routes from wide receiver spots, catching slants and outrunning cornerbacks and putting on the jets. Now, maybe he doesn't have the side-to-side lateral quickness, but he's clearly showing burst on film already in camp, right? And so when I say I'm willing to operate within the gray area, it's not just the AP example. One of the examples that I've given to a couple people who have asked me about this is Steve Smith coming back at age 37 after an Achilles tear. And I was like, all offseason, like, they were describing this as a shredded Achilles. This guy's never going to do anything this year. And he had like an 800-yard season at age 37, which isn't amazing or anything. But for a 37-year-old, probably about as good as I would have expected him to do anyway, right? And this is a guy that was coming off an Achilles, which is supposed to be like an 18-month injury, even worse than an ACL. My point is, some of these athletes are next level, and Steve Smith is one of those, and Adrian Peterson is one of those. And the idea that they might not be able to reach 100% of their production, then my question becomes, well, what's their production level? Because if Breece Hall doesn't tear his ACL and he plays out last year, he's the RB1 right now. I don't think there's really any question about that. We have Christian McCaffrey and Austin Eckler up over age 25. Drafters don't want to take them ahead of the early receivers because they are concerned about age. If Breece Hall has a rookie year that he looked like he was headed towards, which is a superstar year, and then Aaron Rodgers comes into New York, I'm convinced he would be going ahead of Christian McCaffrey this year. And I think the only reason Bijan Robinson isn't is there's some concern about Arthur Smith in Atlanta and how that's going to play out. But that essentially we don't really have a clear RB1 that would have stopped him from getting there. And so if his 100% production would have expected him to be the RB1, how high is that? How legendary of a season are we talking about? Because even if he is only 90% of that, there might still be plenty of room for him to beat his current ADP, is sort of the part of this that I keep coming back to. If he's not 100% himself, what is himself? Is he peak Adrian Peterson? Because that's what he looked like for a stretch last year. And again, Adrian Peterson might be the best comp from the elite level of talent that we think that a Breece Hall might actually be at when he's 100% healthy. And so there's one way of thinking about it where, okay, with these injuries, maybe he doesn't actually have to be 100% because his 100% full level is something that is so above and beyond that drafters aren't really recognizing that you're discounting him to 50% or 60% right now instead of just 90% or 80%. But then there's the other element where, yeah, I mean, down the stretch, these guys could be back to closer to 100%. I mean, we don't know that everyone's going to have the complications that J.K. Dobbins had. So there's sort of two sides to this. But we have seen players come back. And the Steve Smith example is just kind of a wild one that's been in my head lately. But there are really good athletes that heal quicker and get back and don't have complications. We have not seen a lot of those in recent history. But I would just say that I'm more willing to operate within the gray area of the fact that we don't have a lot of data recently either that counteracts, there has been some production decline, I know, with a lot of the recent ACLs, but like I don't think it's been so strong that I'm convinced that like these players can't ever rehab within a 1-year timeline.
And the flip side of it is even thinking too about that kind of re-injury element that you mentioned with Dobbins, because Dobbins actually played quite well the handful of times he was on the field last year. But you can navigate this without even having to take any of those guys. So it's more the new injury risk that we have at extreme levels with running backs. But in terms of starting the season, I mean, you could navigate this area where you take guys like Gibbs and Stevenson and Etienne and Walker and Cook, where those guys are not injured, right? Those guys are not coming back from anything that is meaningful at all. Now, Walker has a new little ding, and in some ways that might be a bigger concern for people, but those guys are not injured. And there's at least a decent possibility, if not a strong probability, that Jonathan Taylor and J.K. Dobbins are not injured at all either, right? Now, maybe there's a little bit there that justifies the hold-in kind of element. But, I mean, they might be very close to 100%. So you can work through that without having to take a Breece Hall or a Javonte Williams if you want. That range has so many big-time names.
Yes, for sure. And so that was a little bit of a tangent and sort of an unnecessary one, probably, because you're right. And the way that I came to this, I know in my writing, and Shawn, we've kind of described it different ways in our writing, but for me, it was that this running back, the peak part of the dead zone, rounds 4, 5, and 6, that dead zone range is the most important part of drafts this year, where there are a lot of options at a lot of different positions, but especially at running back. And the way that I went through it in my next post the next day, I wrote about, the best strategy for home leagues. And the reason I went to home leagues is I get a lot of questions about home leagues over at Stealing Signals. A lot of our listeners are, they're still playing in home leagues. Home leagues are, one of the most important elements of what we do, and the people that we're talking to. Obviously, we also talk about the high stakes stuff and everything else, but we care a lot about the people that are playing and for pride. We talk about it all the time. One of the things that I've told people in home leagues over the years, because the response that I always get, the question I always get is, Ben, you say to get a bunch of receivers in the single digit rounds, and when I get to round 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I still want to keep taking receivers. In my home leagues, these guys are still available. I did a draft for my longest running home league last night as we're recording this. Rashad Bateman on ESPN is ranked at like 170. He ended up going in like around 11. Somebody pulled him way up, but he's ranked at the current moment very, very low over there. Romeo Doubs was ranked very low as a guy that, on an underdog and in a lot of these more competitive environments is going right as the wide receiver window is closing, but you can get him in well into the double digit rounds. There's other examples of guys certainly falling even in the wide receiver window to the deeper range of the wide receiver window, where you have all this extra opportunity. That's this year, but this has been something that I've heard in past years, in 2022 and 2021, what have you, where this wide receiver window is going to stay open until round 12. Whereas on Underdog, it might slam shut at round 8, right? 4 rounds earlier than round 12. And in, FFPC, even with tight end premium and more tight ends going higher, it might still slam shut in round 9 or round 10. But in a home league, you get till round 12 to get your receiver depth. And so the question is, okay, you always say that, zero RB is a good strategy and you want to get these strong receivers, but I can just keep taking them and I want to just keep taking them. And so my response over the years has largely been, well, I don't want to take dead zone running backs, because that's the situation where the wide receiver pick is the most obvious, where the gap between wide receiver and running back historically has leaned the hardest toward you really need to take a receiver in round 4 and round 5 and round 6 in those rounds. And so my advice has often been, well, then start with an anchor running back in the first or the second round. Take an elite tight end in the second or the third round. Unfortunately, for a lot of people I was telling last year, it was Kyle Pitts. It should have been Travis Kelce. That would have been great. But you're starting in the first couple of rounds with these anchor players. The issue that arises, and the thing that I came to this year is, we talked about this, Shawn, about what makes me so excited about 2023 and the strategy that I'm happier about and more confident in than any draft strategy I can remember for a really long time, given what is being offered to us in drafts, is that when I did that, and when I've done that in my own home leagues, you're still taking on a ton of risk in the first couple of rounds when you go running back, or you go maybe even running back to get a couple anchors, because you're going to be able to get 6 receivers from round 4 to round 10 or whatever. You're still taking on a lot of running back risk. And if you have a running back injury, you're basically just giving up your first round pick. Yes, you still have enough receiver depth, but your receiver depth is also not going to be as strong, because a third or a fourth round receiver is not the same profile as a first or a second round receiver. It's just not. You're still going to have good receivers, but you're not going to have great elite receivers in your wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 slot. And all of this was, predicated on the fact that there's not really any other great spot to take the running backs. But the opportunity that we are afforded now with the running backs in the dead zone fits on so many levels, but it particularly fits because it gives us now this opportunity to go wide receiver at the top of the draft and allocate our biggest, most important capital that we don't want to mess up in the first couple of rounds to the safer position, as we always talk about, right? We always say the wide receiver is a safer position, but we also still have an opportunity before, round 10 to take some swings on some real upside running backs, but in a range where the cost is more conducive to what we would like to pay to make that bet. Like I would describe it as in an auction, what I would like to allocate in terms of resources to wide receiver and running back, which for me is always going to be heavier towards receiver because I want some stability in the safer position in my roster. But this year, as we talk about this range of running backs in rounds 4, 5, 6, we can start receiver, hit on those running backs, and then come, and especially in home leagues, like I was saying, where you can come back and still get a JSN and a Quentin Johnston and a Traylon Burks and all these guys later. I mean, your receiver room's going to look just like if you had taken 6 in a row to start a draft. They're still going to be strong down to your wide receiver 6 spot, but you're going to have some really, really interesting running backs built in there in the middle rounds. If you're in a higher stakes format or a more competitive format where that wide receiver window might not stay open longer, it's still a really compelling path because we're still getting the opportunity to get some elite running back ceilings and some really, like you called them, first round profiles, arguably, but we're not having to pay the opportunity cost of the first or the second round. So we can take receivers up there.
And for me, the couple of the names that are perhaps the most interesting as we work through the trade-offs would be Nick Chubb and Tony Pollard. Those are two guys who are not targets for me. And they're maybe the only two players in the entire draft where I consider them to be elite talents, and yet they are not targets because their profiles are available this year at running back in rounds 3 through 6. And the pathway that people have created for them to justify their draft positions is one that takes a look at the environment on their specific teams and says, these guys are going to do something they haven't done in the past because of either offensive scheme or because of the quality of the backups. And that's always really dangerous because now you're making sort of a hope-based determination on a player's workload to justify where they're being taken. And when you contrast that with the guys in that same area, with a Christian McCaffrey, an Austin Eckler, a Bijan Robinson, a Saquon Barkley, we have watched those players do it over and over. Now, the Bijan one, I think you could argue is a little bit more hope-based as well, but he comes in as this perfect, generational prospect. But when you know you're going to get the huge workload and the receiving portion of the workload from McCaffrey and Eckler and Barkley, it's a very different determination than the one with Chubb and Pollard. And so if there are any players that I would expect to be wrong on, or I think that there's a really good chance that I'm wrong on, I would say it's most likely to be players like Chubb and Pollard who are extremely talented. But when we're trying to think through the risks of different running backs, there are extremely talented people in rounds 3 through 6 who historically would not be available there. And we've discussed the ways in which like a reverse zero RB is and is not like the actual zero RB. But one of the things that you're looking to do as you're drafting some running backs in that dead zone range would be to stack upside. And so you're stacking the upside as you're also stacking the risk. But if you get enough of the one, it mitigates some of the other and creates some additional pathways to win. When you're taking that same kind of profile and risk in rounds 1 and 2, specifically in 2023, and then you come back and you're looking at the receivers to build this normal kind of hero RB approach, it is problematic because you don't want to stack so much running back risk in the first 4 rounds that your team almost can't win because it's almost guaranteed to hit landmines. And you already have kind of a hope-based element where you're forecasting forward to these guys actually getting a workload that they haven't had in the past, and that there are some reasons within their profile that's going to make it difficult, right? That I think people don't really want to admit on those players. But when you look at that, if you're going to take a Chubb and a Pollard and then you're going to go forward and add additional running backs, then you have 2 problems, which is 1, now you have a lot of that risk together, and 2, now you don't have any of the wide receivers you need. So you're committing to a very robust running back approach. But if you're not committing to the robust running back approach, which I don't think most drafters are, but you're starting with those players, now you're coming back and you're selecting the weakest wide receivers in the first 10 rounds. The other thing you can potentially do, and I think that some drafters are arguing for him, and
comparatively
makes more sense. Right.
Sorry. The receivers in the first 10 rounds comparative to the alternatives, the opportunity cost, which is weird for drafters, I think, because we've said for years rounds 4 and 5 is where wide receivers comparatively have always been the strongest. But right now, once you get through that first 14 or so receivers and you get into the early part of that next group, you get into where, Terry McLaurin was going before his injury, and DeAndre Hopkins, and, Christian Watson, and DK Metcalf, and even a little further down, Deontay Johnson and some of those guys. Comparatively, that's not the best spot to be drafting receiver this year. It's the worst of the single digits, as you were saying.
Right. And you think about the past and people chasing running back, chasing all of those points, pushing receivers down. And so you're thinking about like the back half of round 3, the first half of round 4, you're getting some stud wide receivers. And if you bank all of those guys, you just end up with a super team. Well, that's not the case this year. And if anything, I mean, you could even argue that 2 or 3 of the players are just like straight up weaker than guys, even without the opportunity cost element, weaker than guys going in round 6 or 7, but definitely adjusted for the price. You have this weakest wide receiver area. Now, the thing that you could do is you can take a Chubb or a Pollard and then also take a Josh Allen and a Darren Waller, say, in some formats. In some formats, those guys aren't going to quite come back to you. But if you take an elite QB out of that range as well, you're opening different pathways to success. You take an elite tight end, different pathways to success. You're not hitting that landmine area at receiver, and you are drafting for this super lineup. And I've argued in home leagues, I think that you should strongly consider that. I mean, very strongly consider the elite QB. But when you think about deeper leagues, and these can be deeper home leagues too, not just high stakes leagues. Obviously, we have some listeners who play in home leagues that are very, very aggressive, right? As you work through those, once you've taken some of these other players where they have to hit on more or less ceiling outcomes and have the other players not hit. I mean, part of the elite QB thesis is that your guy has to hit, but also the breakout guys have to not hit. And you don't really want both of those things to be true when you're making a play. I mean, the thing about the breakout QBs is you just need them to hit. Now, if the elite QBs don't hit, that helps you, right? You can have things that are going to make it better, but you're not wanting to have a thesis that requires this and this and this and all of those type of things to work. The other element for me, Ben, is that if you're taking the non-running back and wide receiver positions in 2023, it makes it very difficult to manage the 2 elements we talk about all the time, which is 1, how do you handle the wide receiver avalanche? And 2, how do you take advantage of this running back value that is there? So when you go with the elite QBs, you say, well, it's only 1 pick, but I mean, you get only 1 of every 12 picks already. So when you have a QB, now it's like I only get 1 pick out of 24 that is something other than a QB in these really high leverage rounds. So again, that's not to say you can never take an elite QB. There are some ways to do it, but those are the trade-offs that we're working through. And then you think about how those trade-offs, cascade or how they work downstream. And if you've taken that QB, if you've taken a move on like a Darren Waller, and Darren Waller has looked fantastic in camp. He's looked fantastic in the preseason. You get the impression that he could have this like 35% target share, which, I mean, if he gets up in that range, it's obviously going to work. But there are young guys and guys coming back off of PUP that people have not really factored into their thinking yet.
Are you thinking about somebody specific when you say young guys coming off PUP?
There are some guys that are going to be added to this group. There's a running back who didn't play in preseason who's going to be added to this group. When you're drafting a lot of guys for their ceiling outcomes, then again, you have to have everybody stay healthy and they have to hit, and you've got a lot of ifs. And then you put all those ifs together, and then you look at rounds, say 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and suddenly you have to be a little bit more conservative, and you are not as able to take advantage of a falling JSN, a falling Treylon Burks, maybe a falling Jerry Jeudy. You're not as able to take a risk on a Zay Flowers or a Quentin Johnston. You're not as able to get the value out of these potential breakout QBs late. And so as we kind of tie that back into this original idea of how do you create a draft where you can be wrong a lot and still come out with a super team, those are some of the trade-offs that I think are really important as we look at even the studs, even the stars, like a Nick Chubb, like a Tony Pollard, because, I mean, they've got to hit in just such a massive way to overcome the other elements. So it's not like a bet against their talent. If anything, I mean, I expect those guys to be absolutely fantastic when they touch the ball this year. It doesn't necessarily solve all the problems in the same way that it didn't in the past. We've talked a lot about the ways in which zero RB in like old school zero RB or pure zero RB or what have you doesn't exactly apply to 2023, but there are still some principles that apply very directly, which is that players like Nick Chubb and Tony Pollard are the types of guys you have to draft when they're 7, 8, 9, 10 guys. And Nick Chubb hasn't been there forever, right? But Tony Pollard was the guy you had to roster when he was in those rounds. Once he's up in round 2, it's the same thing as chasing all of these guys up to where it doesn't work. The only types of players you can draft that early are players like a Christian McCaffrey and an Austin Eckler.
Or arguably some of the players that aren't going that early, right? Like, I think we could argue that Breece Hall has a profile that's worth drafting in those ranges. So, Shawn, as we talk through this, I mean, the part of it that really crystallizes for me and becomes so clear is, and especially when you think about setups where you can still get some receiver depth late, but even if it means trading off some of the receiver depth and being a little more fragile and a little more focused on your starting lineup, which over the years, Shawn, when we talk about the receiver heavy drafts, the zero RB strategy, we talk about redundancy, we talk about depth into the bench. But we also have talked about in other formats how sometimes it leans you towards prioritizing your starting lineup more than the depth at receiver and the bench. When we go into like half PPR standard, we always talk about that. When we go into shallower formats, I think we talk about that. 10-team leagues, it's better to go after the elite onesies because you can get a little bit more depth at receiver later into the draft. There's not as much stress on that wide receiver window. So we've talked about this concept throughout the years. It really is the default in 2023 now. I mean, I'm going into or coming out of a lot of these drafts without the wide receiver depth that I've come to feel comforted by in drafts. But that's okay. That's a trade-off, right? And so that's a goal in drafts. Over the years, I talked about detours and the idea of detours being off of that goal. We're detouring away from that goal. This year, it's less of a detour to me, and it's more of built into what I'm trying to accomplish in a draft. Now, I'm not going to do that in every draft. I mentioned I had a home league last night. I had the 7th pick. I ended up taking Austin Eckler in the first round. So it did change things a little bit. But I went receiver in the next 2 rounds, and then I went to running back in the 4th, and I got Breece all in the 4th round. So it's a very similar version of this where you're going to have slight changes depending on your draft slot, depending on what's available to you, depending on a lot of different things. But in most of the draft slots this year, in the top 5, in the back half of the first round, particularly the later part after. I mean, even arguably where I took Austin Eckler, I should have just went wide receiver. But I think there's a couple spots basically where I would be willing to go with a running back, especially in a situation like a home league where I feel like I must still get enough receiver depth. I was able to get Amon-Ra St. Brown in the 2nd round. So that's probably who I would have taken in the 1st at 7. So, I mean, there's some elements where you're going to change things depending on your situation. But the point I'm trying to make is that there's a pretty clear blueprint. You still can be flexible on it, but it's the blueprint. Now, it's not detours in rounds 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. The goal is now you have a window to target running back upside at an opportunity cost that is palatable that you just shouldn't have in 2023 drafts. And because you're going to have that window, and as you were just talking through, Shawn, if you start with Pollard or Chubb, what are you going to do? Are you going to take those running backs and be very robust? Probably not the right way. Are you going to go to Josh Allen and Mark Andrews or what have you, like you talked about? Probably also not the right way, because now you're very thin at receiver, right? And if you do run into some of those early running back injuries that I was describing my earlier, 2022 and prior home league draft strategy as, if you run into some of that fragility at the top of your build, you don't have enough receiver strength to actually cover that. and this would be an example of having even less receiver strength because we're talking about potentially not even starting the receiver element until like round 5. I think that could feasibly win if you're just right on all the players as we were talking about, but it's not probably the way to take advantage of the trends most extremely. The easiest way to take advantage of it, the thing that gets me excited as I think through this, and I'm like, I want to draft as many teams as I can this year, is if I'm at the back end of the first round, I can start wide receiver so easily. And then at 3-4, I'm going to have star running backs. In some of these home leagues, Jonathan Taylor might be there, because there's people afraid. You talked about bringing him into this group of players that is pushed down for dubious reasons, right? And so it starts, in the third round, even with like a Taylor or a Stevenson. 5-6, you might have Breece Hall. We've seen Travis Etienne go that late. I've taken him at 5-10 in a main event in a high stakes format, Travis Etienne already this year. So there are, and then that's not even getting into Kenneth
Who,
Walker.
just to be clear,
Dobbins.
is a little bit more talented than Tony Pollard. And that's not a shot at Tony Pollard. It's just how good Travis Etienne is.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to his profile at Clemson, people are probably hearing that, and it's shocking. But you go back to what he did in college, and there's a reason Shawn is saying that. And so you start at the back end of the first round, receiver, 3-4, you can start looking at running back. I mean, in some of these home leagues, you might even have T. Higgins there at 3-10 or something. And so, okay, fine, take 3 receivers then. And then look at the early 4th and the 5-6, and then start doing this running back build in those ranges. In the first 5 rounds, where you start with, or first 5 picks, you start with the Jefferson, a Chase, a Kupp, a Hill, what have you. You come back in the second round and you have Jalen Waddle sitting there in some of these leagues, right? Or, you get into the Olave or Higgins range or what have you. And you can do that at the 2-3 turn. The really exciting part is when you hit on those elements of a receiver build, or maybe a receiver. Maybe it's wide receiver times 3. It sort of depends, as I'm kind of trying to lay out. But the real key is getting 2 receivers. Get yourself 2 stud receivers in that top 14. And then come back and plan to go away from receiver and plan to hit running back and hit some upside at running back in those middle rounds. The depth and the heart of the running back dead zone. Your goal should not be, if you're detouring away from running backs. That's the way that it is in 2023. Or you're detouring to a quarterback or a tight end. Those are a little bit detours, right? I think the real structural thing this year, optimally, is starting receiver early in the first couple of rounds and then getting to running back in those middle single-digit rounds and then getting back to receiver at the back end. In round 8, you should be taking a receiver almost every time. And that's just, you can build so many variations of incredibly fun teams. One of the other elements, Shawn, is some years we have had dead zone running backs, but if you wanted to build this way, you had to take that same player in every single draft. And you're like, well, if this running back gets hurt, we did it with a lot of Breece Hall last year in the 4th and 5th round. And then when Breece Hall gets hurt, it sucks. But this year, there's so many different running backs. If you're playing in a dozen leagues, you can build a dozen versions of this team, and they're all going to be different. And they're all going to have different running backs. They're all going to be slight different variations. I just described one where I ended up taking Eckler in the first round, and I didn't take any of the Dobbins and Javonte. I went Ayuk in like the 5th round over those guys because I had taken Eckler in 1 and Hall in 4. And so a little bit of a variation on this. I did actually take a receiver in the range we were talking about. Probably isn't the best spot to take a receiver, but he was only my wide receiver 2 or 3. I guess 3. But anyway, you're going to have little slight variations. You can get exposure to different types of players as a result of that. But you can have this build in a lot of different ways, and it just feels like the optimal way to build.
I really like the note about the different combinations. That's something we've sort of hinted at, but saying it very explicitly, I think, is important because, otherwise, if that one guy gets hurt, then you're in a little bit of trouble. One of the things that also, made me think of there is that, zero RB is just very different in 2023 than what you're actually trying to accomplish. And I see a lot of these teams that are maybe wide receiver times 4 and then a couple of running backs, but the wide receivers drafted did not have the upside that a wide receiver times 4 start in the past would give you. And then the running backs in rounds 5 and 6 are actually quintessential dead zone backs. And so just the fact that you waited until rounds 5 and 6 does not then free you up to draft players with bad profiles. It doesn't help you that you got them less expensively, because I think one of the things people are going to think about is, well, Josh Jacobs going so late last year was a big deal. and Miles Sanders going so late was a big deal. And it was, and yet Josh Jacobs needed to actually score a lot of points to make that work, right? It wasn't just the pricing element. And then Miles Sanders, probably he had a very good advance rate on Underdog, but in most styles of play, Miles Sanders is still not the guy who's going to actually do things for you that you need. And so if you have Miles Sanders or even a weaker version of that, and people are drafting a weaker version of Miles Sanders in many cases, if nothing else, then they're just drafting Miles Sanders again. Who is in a much weaker situation than he was last year.
Let's be clear on Miles Sanders, and especially, he plays up in half PPR versus PPR, but he was very spike weeky last year, which is very helpful in best ball when you get a lot of your points. I just pulled up his half PPR in a few weeks. Yeah, I pulled up his half PPR game log. He had 3 games last year of 28 or more points. And then no other games. Week 1, he was at 17.5. In the playoffs, he had a 17.0 game. No other games really over 15. Several games in single digits. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I think 10 if you count, his playoff games as well. So really there's 21 games here in his game log. But basically half of his games were in single digits. But in best ball, you have other running backs to cover that. In season long, as you were describing, people were starting him in these games. Like this is going into people's lineups. So the spike weeky and the way that his profile, he had all 3 of those games where he had 28 plus points. He had at least 134 rushing yards and 2 rushing TDs, and he really grabbed that stuff together in those weeks, and it really helps the advance rate and all of those things when you're bunching up the points like that. So anyway. I think you said that so well, because Miles Sanders is a great example of a player who looks really good in best ball advance rates, which is the best data we have to show whether a guy was a good pick at ADP, but in season-long leagues was worse, period, and substantially worse. That's the way those things actually play out. We don't have great data on that, but he was not as helpful to his season-long managers who had to start him and take those 5.3-point games, as opposed to the best ball guys who were able to just put another running back in there in those weeks. And yes, he's a great example of a kind of quintessential dead zone player this year. I love the way you said that, because there are a lot of people. There's other running backs, Sean, but I'll just say the running backs that I have listed as fades in those ranges: Joe Mixon, Aaron Jones, Najee Harris, Alexander Madison, James Conner, Dalvin Cook. That's a list of guys. I'm just reading you right off the Stealing Signals rankings that I have listed as fades that I think people are mixing in with the Kenneth Walker, J.K. Dobbins, Javonte Williams, James Cook profiles as similar. Look at all this running back value we have, and there's a demonstrative difference.
And so we're wanting to make sure we're thinking about a 0 RB team in the correct way. If you do decide to deploy 0 RB in 2023, and there are ways to do it and still win. And I think that it's a kind of a safe way to play, that you're not going to be that disappointed, but you do have to take the right profiles. And one of the things that, again, we've been, very much sort of talking around, but I want to be explicit about, is that the top 15 wide receivers this year are extremely exciting. And there is a possibility that guys like Devontae Smith and T. Higgins, who are right now 13 and 15, there's a possibility that they'll get hit with target volume concerns that maybe drop them down quite a bit. But there are also a lot of scenarios in which they do very well. There are also some scenarios in which they actually score as wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 because of injuries, which we hope don't happen. But the range of outcomes there, very provocative. Wide receiver 16, and I would include Keenan Allen, even though he is a target for us, but wide receiver 16 to wide receiver 30 is gross. And again, there are a couple of guys in there that we do kind of like, but big picture, the whole idea of 0 RB and how you're hitting the receivers is that you're going to draft receivers before that group, right? You want to get to the 3 and ideally the 4 before you hit that range that's not very appetizing. And my sense of it,
you're talking about in past years, in 2021, maybe in 2016. You wrote this article initially in 2013. And there's where that break happens is different every year. This year it's about 15, and then it's switching over to the less appetizing receivers. Some years maybe there were 20. But more importantly, running backs were going so much heavier that you could take a top 15 receiver in round 4. You can't do that in 2023.
And I think that in the same way that drafters in the past who were pushed onto running backs by the market would draft too conservatively, that now people who are being pushed onto wide receivers by the market are drafting wide receivers too conservatively and pulling up some of these guys who don't even do what you want in that range. So my argument would be that perhaps wide receiver 16 through wide receiver 30 is actually weaker profile-wise than it has been at some points in the past, or perhaps just that there is more density of some of the weak profiles and less density of some of the profiles that we like. Anyway, you can easily draft a 0 RB team where you don't have either the wide receivers or the running backs that a prototypical 0 RB drafter would want, and it will not accomplish the same objectives for you. So that's something that's important that we say straight out. And then kind of working back, Ben, to these first 2 rounds and this foundation, I guess I don't want to leave without, again, just being very clear on what I am drafting. It was interesting because I got to do the main event draft with you and the Ship Chasers, and we were disappointed. We had the 106, and we were disappointed that Christian McCaffrey fell to us instead of Cooper Kupp. And then as the draft progressed, it actually worked out very, very nicely. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I mentioned kind of in my wrap up for that as we were closing out was that I was glad we got McCaffrey with how it fell, in part because McCaffrey is the only running back, and is probably not quite the same now. He's a little bit older. He's had these injuries. He's in a San Francisco offense where there are so many weapons that for him to get quite enough volume to, go 25 plus, and certainly, to get to the area where he was challenging 30. I mean, there are probably 5 or 6 teams in the NFL right now where if Christian McCaffrey were on those teams, he would be a legitimate threat to score 30 points a game. He's not with the 49ers, but it also gives him a very high floor, I think. So the floor ceiling with him is still much better than with anybody else. For me right now, unless something odd happens in the next week that would dramatically change a profile for any of these running backs, Christian McCaffrey is the only running back that I would select in the first 2 rounds, and every other type of team that I would build is going to be wide receiver, with the slight possibility that there are going to be some Mark Andrews teams in there.
Because you hate Austin Eckler.
No, I mean, Austin Eckler is great. I mean, he was obviously a tournament winner last season. But if he's a discount Christian McCaffrey and there are more risks with him, again, I don't think that you can take him over the receivers here. Now,
I think that's fair.
I don't think you can take him.
I am obsessed with high value touches, and the fact that he was first in receptions last year and second in green zone touches. I mean, he is the current high value touch god. So I am willing to take him in situations like I did last night, especially where I have the ability to still get 2 of the wide receivers in the top 15. It would have been fun to build with 3 of them, though. I mean, to be fair, 3 of those top wide receivers.
No, Ben,
but no, I hear you.
Plug here for you. You released your Mastiff coverage. And
yes.
This is a little bit of an odd throw in here, but I wanted, you were talking about Austin Eckler. If you're in a $1,000 best ball tournament and maybe one with a structure where it's sort of 50-50-ish, I mean, do you feel comfortable? Let's say you get the 108. And
I'd take a receiver.
Which you won't necessarily do.
Yeah.
You would take a receiver instead of Austin Eckler.
I would take a receiver, yeah. That's a great point. I'm sitting here defending my home league draft from last night, but I did have the 103. I took Cooper Kupp at 103. I didn't mess around with McCaffrey. But yeah, that I appreciate you bringing that up. That is on the site for Stealing Signal subs, bengresh.subsite.com. Anyone who wants to read through that. It is an example of a draft in a high stakes best ball format where I did the wide receiver start, took Ramondre Stevenson in the 3rd, and then built from there. Took an early quarterback, took J.K. Dobbins a little bit later, Did have to mix in more receivers because it's best ball, and you kind of need to, and especially on Underdog where the wide receiver window closes so early. I did have to mix in some more in that. Round 4, I took a receiver. Round 6, I took a receiver, but built a really fun team with this same idea that, receiver gives you the core, and then you can hit some running backs in the round 3 to round 7 range, and you can potentially mix in, in this format, I thought it made a lot of sense to mix in a high-end quarterback. You could potentially hit a tight end. As you were talking through the 0 RB ideas, I mean, again, I think this year, we've talked through a lot this year that it's almost not necessary because we actually have this depth of running back options. But if you did want to go that way, I was sort of joking earlier that if you're taking a detour in rounds 4, 5, 6, you're detouring away from the running backs who are the right picks. I do think you would want to make sure you had an elite quarterback and an elite tight end, which we always talk about as a key of 0 RB. And so really it would be sort of thinking through, okay, I am detouring in round 4 to take, whoever it is, Lamar Jackson, and I am detouring in round 5 to take Kyle Pitts or whoever. And then the other picks in the top 8 rounds are a lot of receivers. And then you come back in round 9, you start to take some of Sean's 0 RB targets. You get some guys that have some early season potential that are probably underpriced, maybe a Brian Robinson, maybe a Khalil Herbert, some guys like that. That team can probably win. I mean, I would go to bat with that team. But it just doesn't feel as necessary this year. And the opportunity, again, that is provided in the middle of the running back dead zone, that is the most important part of drafts this year. There's a lot of flexibility there. I just described a 0 RB where you're willing to go quarterback and tight end in that range, which you can be willing to do. But the big opportunity there is the running backs. And if you want to take a couple of those, you want to start your draft receiver, as you just said, Sean. And for you, it's McCaffrey or no one. And I think that's fair. The only reason I got defensive about the Eckler thing is I am very close to that stance. But it's like I have a slightly different read on Eckler.
But no, that's good. We want to give out, who we're looking at as potential legitimate running back picks, because there are going to be some listeners and drafters who do want to take that anchor RB. So knowing which guys we're on is good.
We love Bijan Robinson, Sean, and you mentioned Pollard and Chubb as tough ones. Saquon Barkley is another one that we do really like from talent perspectives. The hard thing with those guys, and I'm sure we'll get questions about those guys, when they go at the 1-2 turn, is, again, it's not even so much that I would rather have the receivers there. It's what I'm sacrificing from a build perspective, because you can make a similar bet 2 rounds later. Breece Hall is not that different of a bet than Bijan Robinson, as much as people don't want to hear that. And that's the point I've tried to make to everyone, is like, when I get these questions about Bijan, I really like Bijan Robinson's profile. Probably if he didn't land in Atlanta, I'd be in on him more. I'm certainly a little bit scarred from Arthur Smith, so that's fair, and maybe I'm over responding to that. But for me, it's okay if I don't take him here, I can take a player that I think has a similar upside scenario, not a similar week 1 role. It might look silly in week 5 because Bijan might be off to a historic first 4 weeks, and Hall might be coming along very slowly. But I'll still at that point, I think, argue that the second half of the season they're going to look similar, probably. And the risks associated with taking an early running back, the injury risks, the other things that can happen, will still be there for both. They'll still, I mean, it's not that Hall is more risky just because he's coming off an injury. Bijan is in some ways this year's Breece Hall. We saw him absolutely hitting last year and then get hurt, and it was horrible. And no one wants to see that for Bijan Robinson this year. That would be so frustrating after the last couple of years. Every good young running back keeps getting hurt, and it's just awful. I'm not saying that, obviously I'm not rooting for that, but it is a risk with any running back you build into your profile early, and really any player. The NFL is a dangerous league and dangerous sport. We know that. But what you sacrifice to take him at, pick 10, as opposed to going receiver there, from a build perspective, is challenging. And it's similar to what you're just saying with Eckler. And I mean, are there scenarios where you would take Bijan in a PPR where you start 3 receivers, as you start to cut off the receivers, maybe you start only 2? Are there scenarios where Bijan fits into it for you?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen him fall to like the 203. And in that scenario, Amon-Ra, CeeDee Lamb, Garrett Wilson could all be gone. And if you can draft him in the second after taking one of those guys in the first, and you can say, well, it's just the same thing as if you did it the opposite way. But we're saying in a scenario where you can't actually get the second wide receiver as well, then I think it can make some sense, especially if you're on Keenan Allen or you're on Deebo Samuel. Because one of the things you can do in round 3 is take one of those guys. Then you've got the 2 receivers with the running back there. And so when you come back in round 4, you can take ETN or Hall or Walker. And now you've got 2 stud wide receivers. You've got 2 anchor running backs. You have the flexibility to move through the rest of your draft in a very dynamic way, taking best player available, which, I mean, best player available is kind of always what we've recommended. It just takes different guises because different structures are going to get you to best player available in different years. But I mean, just simply thinking about it without layering on other things and just thinking best player available is actually a very productive way, I think, to be kind of working through this 2023.
I love that because it always, like, structural drafting always gets pushed against best player available, but I love that point. It's another great Shawnism when, as we're like winding down, we're nearing the hour mark, and you're saying something that is so profound. But hopefully the listeners are all still here. But you just said we're kind of always describing best player available. It's just we're thinking of best player differently. Like when we're talking about zero RB and other years, and we're talking about the running back dead zone, it's very clear that the ways to build upside into your roster, the hits, the league winners, the things that actually matter, the things that we are actually trying to get with basically every pick is as much firepower and as much potential to dominate your league and to get the players that matter for this season. It's just the dead zone and zero RB and all of those things lead you to draft the positions that have those players in those spots of the draft. So it really is best player available. It's just that most other people see the running back projections and say, you know, in other years, I'm saying, and see them as being the best player available in some ranges where we would argue it's very clear that the best player available is a wide receiver. This year, it's different. But I just love that point. I'm sorry to cut you off, but the zero RB strategy as best player available is, I mean, that's the way to think of it.
And kind of as we wrap up here, you know, you can think through too, make sure you're looking at your own board and your own targets and getting a sense of what ADP is on the platform that you're going to draft. Because, you know, Drake London is interesting because Matt Irby has written some great pieces for us recently about how to dominate home leagues. One of the things he mentions there is Drake London as a really high priority player. The interesting thing, if you're going to play FFPC, certainly if you're going to play Underdog, is that he's in a range where you've got to be kind of optimistic about how that Falcons offense works for him to really do what you need at the 4-5 turn. And so unless you have that level of optimism, it is a little problematic for him and DJ Moore and DeAndre Hopkins and then someone like Mike Williams, who for me, I think is completely off the board in 2023. I mean, those guys being at the 4-5 turn, if you have a pick in the 101 to 104 area, that causes big problems for you if you need receivers there. But if you're in a format where ADPs are a little bit different, Drake London is priced at ridiculous levels on like ESPN, Yahoo, CBS, what have you. And so if you're drafting there tonight or there this weekend, what have you, and Drake London is a mild target for you, he's going to do very different things for you when you're drafting that type of team. So make sure you get back to your board and look at what the opportunities are going to be. That should very much inform how you go about it. I feel very strongly about having player targets and player targets within a certain draft environment, and that you want to figure out how to get the most total number of those guys that you can. And that part of it is fun because it gives you a little bit different puzzle, a little bit different question each time you go out there and draft.
Yep, that's a great way to put it too. And I think a great way for it to end. I mean, that's the goal ultimately. How can you get the most firepower onto your roster, the best group of I mean, it's not just depth, because we talk about auction strategy. And I mean, one of the mistakes I used to make in auction was loved to sort of forego some of the top end players because I just like, oh my gosh, in this format, I can get a whole roster of round 3 and round 4 and round 5 guys. And I would love to do that and have this really efficient draft and get great prices on all these guys. But then you don't really have, number one, you have really tough decisions and start sits every week, and you don't really have the true trump cards sometimes. And so yeah, my auction play has evolved over the years to where I'm pretty willing to pay up for the highest priced player. That's something, Shawn, in past years you've talked a lot about when we've covered auctions, the stars and scrubs approach a little bit. But like getting up and getting a Justin Jefferson and then doing some of that efficiency stuff after that. Or the big one is I get a lot of questions about Superflex auction, and I start telling people, go pay for the top quarterbacks. I mean, there's something worth paying for. Go pay for them, and then be efficient and deep the rest of the way. But the point is, it's not just about quantity of bets. It's not just about depth of bets, because they have to be strong, and they do get weaker the later you go. A round 6 receiver that's still in the wide receiver window is interesting, but not as interesting as a round 2 receiver, a round 1 receiver. Now, some of the round 6 receivers are maybe more interesting than some of the round 3s. Like we said, Jahan Dotson and George Pickens probably more interesting than Amari Cooper, but that's a discussion for another day. But having said that, you're trying to load your roster with the most firepower you can. Some of the bets are stronger than others. It's not just a matter of quantity. And this year, I mean, as much as the running backs are riskier, they could get hurt. Some of the guys coming back from injury might not be 100%, and they might be a bit of a disappointment. But the upside present in the profiles that are available, from Breece Hall to Kenneth Walker to J.K. Dobbins to Javonte Williams to James Cook, what these guys were as prospects, what they have done so far at the NFL level, what their offenses are telling you in terms of how they're structuring things for this season. Even the ones that have brought in secondary backs, like NFL teams are largely doing some type of committee or some type of balance, but the threats aren't there on a talent level of these guys. These guys are better than their teammates. The drafters and the ADP is giving you that window, and that's one of the key parts of accomplishing this goal that you just said, Shawn, of getting the most firepower, getting the most targets into your roster, the maximum amount of potential to really hit on guys that are making a huge difference, that are going to be league winners. You're going to cut players. You're going to churn your roster. You want to find players in your draft that stick all year long as stars. And this range is a big part of where that can go right for you at the running back position, certainly. And then the obvious corollary that we come to here is then do it at receiver in the first 2 rounds and get those guys as well. And you can build just some incredible teams.
I think that's the perfect way to end it. We're rooting for everyone to build incredible teams for their most important leagues in 2023. Hopefully you still have some fun teams to draft. We will be coming to you with our FFPC main event later on in the week. And again, it just is so much fun. We hope that some of you join us over at the FFPC playing the main event. We would love for a Stealing Bananas listener to win the $1 million. Then when you and I draft, it's basically digressions the whole way. So it's going to be fun player discussions. I'm looking forward to having that part of it out. And then again, we go through some of this in terms of how it would work in an actual draft. You might be surprised by some of the guys that we land. That part, I think, again, always fun in 2023. So come back and check us out for that. But I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch, whom you can follow at Yards Per Gretch. Mentioned some of those amazing articles coming out on Stealing Signals. Make sure you are signed up. Also sign up for the Betting Project with Dalton Cates. We'd love to have you guys join us over at RotoViz and save as much money as you can. The coupon code is RVRadio 2023 at checkout for a 10% discount on your 1-year subscription. We'll be announcing the winners of the rating and review contest soon, and I'll be setting up to play some Fantasy Pros contests over at the FFPC. Try to win that $1 million here in the next week and a half as well. Then next 7, 8, 9, 10 days, whatever we have, is going to be wall-to-wall drafting, the best week and a half of the entire year. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.